Queen Elizabeth took some secrets about her private jewelry collection to her grave, and honestly, the more you dig into this story, the more jaw-dropping it gets. Because this was never just about jewelry. It was about power, loyalty, and a very deliberate, very calculated message.
There is a woman who stood between Camilla Parker Bowles and a jewelry collection worth over $100 million for 17 years. She was not a lawyer, she was not a constitutional officer, she held no formal protective authority of any kind. Her title was senior dresser, and when someone suggested, shortly after Camilla married Charles in 2005, that the new Princess of Wales might expect access to Queen Elizabeth's private collection, this woman looked at them and said, "That woman will touch these jewels over my dead body." She also said, "She didn't build anything here. She burned something down, and I am not handing her the silver to replace what she destroyed." Her name was Angela Kelly, and Queen Elizabeth never once told her she was wrong. This is the story of the most powerful jewelry collection in the world, and the 2 decades of deliberate, calculated silence that Elizabeth used it to deliver. Act 1. The Woman with the Keys. To understand any of what follows, you need to understand what Angela Kelly actually was inside that palace. Her official title, personal advisor and senior dresser to the Queen, tells you almost nothing about her real role. Kelly controlled physical access to Elizabeth's private collection. Not the crown jewels in the Tower of London. Those belong to the state and are managed through constitutional protocol. The pieces Kelly guarded were different, over 1,000 individual items. Locked leather cases, velvet-lined drawers inside Elizabeth's personal apartments at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Each piece carrying emotional history that Kelly understood better than almost anyone alive. She had spent enough years reading Elizabeth's silences to know exactly what they meant. And the silence around Camilla and the private jewelry was the loudest, most sustained silence in the entire palace. Camilla moved quickly aft. The 2005 wedding. She submitted formal inquiries through proper palace channels asking about specific pieces, pearl and diamond items Elizabeth had worn early in her reign and hadn't been seen publicly in years. Camilla was constitutionally the Princess of Wales. She had every reason to expect a response. The inquiries went to Kelly. They never came back. No refusal, no explanation, no alternative suggestion, just silence. Complete, deliberate silence. Camilla understood it perfectly. She had spent 3 decades learning to read this family's disapproval. So she wore her own jewelry to her early engagements, smiled at exactly the right moments, and locked whatever she was actually feeling somewhere no one could see it. Charles eventually raised the matter carefully with his mother. Elizabeth looked at him and told him plainly that the collection was hers and she would manage it exactly as she always had. And that was the end of that conversation. Act 2. The tiara Kelly placed with her own hands. April 29, 2011. Catherine Middleton is standing in a dressing room at the Goring Hotel on the morning of her wedding. Angela Kelly, the same woman who had said Camilla would touch these jewels over her dead body, walks in carrying the Cartier Halo tiara, and she places it on Catherine's head with her own hands. The Cartier Halo is not the grandest piece in the vault. It is a relatively delicate band, 16 graduated scrolls, over 700 diamonds, purchased by the Duke of York for his wife in 1936, and later gifted to Princess Elizabeth for her 18th birthday in 1944. Elizabeth never wore it publicly, not once. It passed briefly to Princess Margaret and Princess Anne, then disappeared into the vault for roughly 40 years. The reason Elizabeth chose it for Catherine matters more than the piece itself. The Cartier Halo had zero connection to Diana. Royal family where almost every significant piece of jewelry carried someone else's grief, handing Catherine something with no painful history was an act of genuine generosity. A clean beginning. For a commoner stepping into that arena for the very first time, that was the kindest possible opening Elizabeth could offer. But the halo was just the opening move. Act 3. The bracelet built from everything left. To understand what happened at the state banquet for the President of China in October 2015, you need to know the story behind a single bracelet, because the story behind it is genuinely heartbreaking. It begins with Princess Alice of Battenberg, Philip's mother. Alice was born completely deaf. She communicated her entire life by reading lips in 4 languages simultaneously. She married into the Greek royal family, built a life, raised 5 children. Then in 1930, the people closest to her had her committed to a Swiss mental asylum against her will. Her children were distributed among relatives across Europe. Philip was 8 years old, passed between distant households, sleeping in borrowed rooms, in the specific loneliness of a child nobody quite knows what to do with. Alice eventually returned to Greece, and when the Nazis occupied Athens during the Second World War, she hid Jewish families inside her own apartment at direct personal risk to her life. German officers would come to question her about the whereabouts of Jewish people in the city. She would look at them and say she didn't understand the question. She was deaf, after all. By the end of the war, Alice had almost nothing. One thing she still held was a tiara, a wedding gift from Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, the same family that had been taken to a basement in Yekaterinburg and shot by Bolshevik forces just 2 years after giving her that gift. When Philip came to her in 1947, with no money and a royal wedding approaching, she handed him that tiara without hesitating. He took it to a London jeweler, had the diamonds extracted, and had them reset into a bold, geometric, Art Deco bracelet that he placed on Elizabeth's wrist on their wedding day in November 1947. That bracelet was built from diamonds that had belonged to a murdered dynasty, held for decades by a woman who lost her mind and nearly her life, and then used what remained of herself to protect strangers from genocide. Philip dismantled the last thing his mother owned because he wanted to give Elizabeth something that came from somewhere honest. Elizabeth wore that bracelet every single day of their marriage for 73 years. In October 2015, Catherine walked into that state banquet wearing the Edinburgh bracelet on her wrist. The geometric platinum face of it caught the light and sent it across the room. Everyone present who understood what they were looking at felt the full weight of what Elizabeth had just done. Reaching into the most private drawer of her entire collection, handing someone the bracelet her husband built by hand from his mother's last treasure. That is not a casual gesture. That is a declaration, a total and irreversible act of acceptance. And Elizabeth made it publicly, with Camilla sitting at the same banquet table. Act 4. The necklace and the man it destroyed. The most financially devastating statement Elizabeth ever made with her jewelry came wrapped in one of the most uncomfortable histories attached to any object in the private collection. In 1947, the Nizam of Hyderabad, by some calculations the single wealthiest man alive at the time, sent a representative to Cartier in London with instructions that were staggering in their simplicity. Let the princess choose anything from the entire stock. No financial limit, no cost whatsoever. Elizabeth chose a platinum lacework necklace featuring 13 emerald-cut diamonds of extraordinary clarity, a dramatic detachable double-drop pendant, and a pave-set center that sent light exploding across any room it entered. Conservative modern estimates place its value between $40 and $60 million, the single most expensive piece in the private collection outside the Crown estate. 10 months after the Nizam sent that necklace, the Indian government sent its military into Hyderabad in what it called a police action and forcibly annexed the entire state. The Nizam's authority was abolished overnight. His fortune was largely confiscated or frozen. The palace that had housed his legendary collection began physically crumbling because he could no longer afford to maintain it. The man who had told Cartier to let a princess choose anything she wanted from their entire stock spent the remaining 19 years of his life watching everything he had built get taken apart piece by piece. He died in 1967 with almost nothing intact. His descendants spent the next 7 decades in legal battles across multiple continents. One dispute over funds deposited in a London bank account during the chaos of partition dragged through British courts for 71 years before being resolved in 2019. Let that land. The necklace Elizabeth placed around Catherine's neck at the National Portrait Gallery Gala in 2014 was purchased with the last free money of a man whose entire world was dismantled within 10 months of sending it. Now add the detail almost no outlet reported at the time. Earlier in 2014, Camilla had made a formal inquiry through an intermediary asking about the Nizam necklace for a state occasion. The inquiry received no response. Months later, that same necklace appeared on Catherine's neck in photographs that circled the globe within hours. Every person inside that palace knew the inquiry had been made. Every person inside that palace saw who was wearing the necklace. Act 5. The portrait Elizabeth never gave. The most personal statement Elizabeth made was also the smallest. The Royal Family Order of Elizabeth II is the most intimate honor in the entire British monarchy, and most people have never heard of it. There is no committee, no constitutional process, no parliamentary vote, no public ceremony of any kind. The sovereign alone decides in private who is worthy of receiving it. The piece itself is a miniature painted portrait of the Queen set in a diamond frame, suspended on a pale yellow silk ribbon. Female members of the royal family pin it to their chest at state banquets and diplomatic receptions. What it communicates to everyone in the room who understands royal protocol is simple and devastating. The Queen personally considered this woman, looked at her closely, and decided she was trusted enough to carry the Queen's own face pressed against her body. Elizabeth gave the royal family order to Catherine. She never gave it to Camilla. Sit with that for a moment. Camilla was constitutionally the Princess of Wales from 2005. She later became Queen Consort, the second most senior woman in the entire British monarchy. Elizabeth never once gave her the portrait to wear. Catherine, the wife of the second in line to the throne, received it. One woman got the constitutional title because the law required it. The other woman got the portrait because Elizabeth personally wanted her to have it. The distance between those two things was not subtle, it was enormous, and everyone inside that family understood exactly what it meant. Act 6. The crown Diana called Frankenstein. And then there is the Cambridge Lover's Knot, and what it had already done to the women who wore it before Catherine ever touched it. Queen Mary commissioned the piece in 1913. Visually, it is breathtaking. Gothic diamond arches in platinum, 19 large natural pearls hanging from diamond stems, swinging freely with every movement of the wearer's head. Wearing it is a genuinely punishing physical experience. The weight of the platinum frame drives directly into the skull. The momentum of 19 swinging pearls pulls at the hair with every single step. Elizabeth wore it briefly in the 1950s and retired it almost immediately. Then in 1981, Charles pulled it out of the vault for Diana. Diana wore the lover's knot throughout the 1980s at state banquets and diplomatic receptions, smiling radiantly in photograph after photograph under those diamond arches while her marriage was privately being destroyed from the inside. She was fighting bulimia behind closed doors. Her husband was emotionally absent. The entire palace knew where his attention actually was. Diana called it her Frankenstein crown in private. She hated standing in gilded rooms under a crown that felt like it was crushing her, because that was exactly what her life inside that family felt like every single day. The tiara went back into the vault when the marriage collapsed. Diana was dead 11 months later. William eventually retrieved it for Catherine. And then a detail emerged in 2017 that almost nobody reported and even fewer people fully grasped. Jewelry specialists examining close photographs identified that at least 2 of the 19 original natural pearls had been damaged or lost during the years the tiara spent in storage and had been quietly replaced with cultured pearls, slightly different in luster from the originals. The tiara Catherine wears is not entirely the same object Diana wore. Parts of it are gone. Parts of it have been replaced and rebuilt to look unbroken. The crown that has become Catherine's most recognizable piece is, in a very specific and material sense, a repaired object wearing the identity of something that was never supposed to break. The parallel to the monarchy itself requires no further explanation. Elizabeth died in September 2022. The crown jewels passed to Charles automatically. They belong to the state and always have. But Elizabeth's private collection, those locked leather cases and velvet-lined drawers holding between $60 and $100 million in emotionally loaded personal jewelry, existed in a legal gray space nobody had fully repaired for publicly. In the months following the funeral, reports emerged describing how Camilla had quietly raised the question of redistribution, asking through appropriate channels whether the pieces Catherine had been using on extended personal loan for over a decade should now be formally reassigned to reflect the new constitutional reality. Camilla was now Queen Consort. Catherine was Princess of Wales. The hierarchy had shifted. And for the first time since 2005, there was no Angela Kelly blocking the door, no Elizabeth deciding in silence that Camilla didn't deserve a key. Charles declined to make any immediate changes. He understood, with the political instincts of a man who had spent his entire life watching power operate inside this family, that any visible transfer of Elizabeth's private jewelry away from Catherine would ignite a public reaction that no communications team could contain. The bracelet Philip built from Romanov diamonds and his mother's last possession. The pearls the Queen Mother had warned would carry sorrow into a marriage. The necklace purchased with the last free fortune of a man the Empire then helped destroy. The miniature portrait Elizabeth chose to give one woman and not the other. All of it now sitting in contested territory. On one side, a constitutional queen who had been shut out of this collection for 2 decades. On the other, a future queen who had spent those same 2 decades earning every single piece she held. Elizabeth used silence as precisely as any weapon this family has ever wielded. That silence can no longer be maintained by anyone else. What happens to that collection next will say everything about where the real power inside this institution has actually landed. And if the past 20 years have shown us anything, Catherine is not the kind of woman who lets go of something without making absolutely sure everyone in the room understands exactly why. So, where do you think this lands? Does Camilla have a legitimate case that the hierarchy shift means the collection should be redistributed? Or did Elizabeth's 20 years of deliberate choices settle this question before she ever died? Drop your take in the comments. The jewelry is almost secondary. This is really a story about power, legacy, and what Elizabeth actually believed. And I want to know how you read it. If you're new here, subscribe. The story of this collection and what happens to it now is far from over. You'll want the documented account when the next chapter arrives.